ExpressLRS has got a lot of things going for it. Incredible range and penetration, low-cost hardware, hardware available from a wide variety of vendors, so it's never out of stock, and exciting, if you're into that sort of thing, developments and new features coming out constantly. But one of the most annoying things about ExpressLRS, especially for people who are just getting into it, is the binding procedure. And the purpose of this video is to tell you that binding in ExpressLRS is about to get a whole lot easier and a whole lot more intuitive. I'm Joshua Bardwell, and you're going to learn something today. Why in the hell doesn't ExpressLRS just bind like other receivers that you may be used to? You push the bind button on the receiver, and you push a bind button or some other bind function on the module or the controller, and it binds. Well, the good news is that after this update, we're looking right now at this pull request, allow all binding methods on RX. This pull request will be going into ExpressLRS 3.4, which isn't out yet, but I'm so excited about it, I'm making this video before it's even out. And when that happens, ExpressLRS will have traditional button-based binding, just like you might be used to. But it's more complicated than that. Of course it is. This is ExpressLRS. Let's dive into the details. So the way binding works now is if you have a receiver with a button on it, that button is now a bind button, in addition to all the stuff that the button used to do. And you may be thinking, what did that button used to do? I never used it for anything because I expected it to be a bind button, and then it wasn't a bind button, and then I just was like, okay, what's the point of this button? That button has done several things, actually. One of the things it's done is if you hold the button down before powering up, it puts the receiver into bootloader mode so you can flash the receiver using a programming adapter. This is pretty much only going to be done if you've bricked the receiver and don't have any other way to flash it. Holding down that button for some length of time, I don't remember what length, would force the receiver into Wi-Fi mode if you didn't want to wait that 60-second timeout for it to go into Wi-Fi mode. And holding down the receiver for some other length of time would actually factory reset the receiver. The reason I'm not telling you the length of time is that the lengths of times have changed now that binding is in the mix, but all of that functionality has been preserved. The way it works now is if you have a button and you hold that button down for 2 seconds, after powering up the receiver will go into bind mode. Just hold it down for 2 seconds. If you hold it down for 7 seconds, it'll force Wi-Fi start. And if you hold it down for 15 seconds, it will fully reset all of the options on the receiver. This is actually more useful than you might think because there are some software options that could make your receiver not work. For example, someone could go into the web UI and change the baud rate, or change the output inversion. These are options that if they were changed by somebody else and you got the receiver and you wired it up and it wasn't working, you might go, oh, well, I'm going to try holding the button down for 15 seconds and see if that makes it work again. So we've got all these different methods of binding. The next question is, like, which one is authoritative? Like, for example, if I flash the receiver with a bind phrase, and then I go into the web UI and manually type in a bind phrase, and then I press the button for 2 seconds to bind, like, who wins? And the answer to that question is the last one. The last one that got updated. So you could flash it with a certain bind phrase baked into the firmware, and then decide you don't like that and go into the web UI and type a bind phrase in, and then decide you don't like that and hold down the button for 2 seconds and bind it to a different module. It's just the last one. And the other thing is that there used to be some weird interactions where if you flashed it with a bind phrase and then you put a bind phrase in the web UI, the old bind phrase was kind of remembered and it might like fail back, and there was some inconsistency, and all of that has been resolved. Basically, the last bind that you did is the bind, the only bind, and that's it. Brilliant. In the past, I've been surprised when I put a receiver into binding mode and then was fiddling around for a while and came back to bind and it wasn't in binding mode anymore, it was in Wi-Fi mode. In older firmwares, the Wi-Fi timeout still applied even when you put the receiver into binding mode, which I thought wasn't right. And apparently the devs agreed. Now the receiver will stay in binding mode indefinitely once it is put into binding mode. It won't fail over into Wi-Fi mode. Bullet point number 7 really confused me. There is now an option in the web UI to never save binding information and always enter bind mode when you first power up. Which means that I bind the quadcopter, I go fly the quadcopter, I land the quadcopter, I unplug the quadcopter, I plug it back in again, and now it's unbound and I have to rebind it. And I asked one of the Betaflight devs, one of the ExpressLRS devs, I asked, what the hell is the purpose of this? Who wants this? And he said that there are some users of cinema drones where they've just got a stable of drones. They got 5 or 10 drones that they're using on the job, and they might have 3 or 4 pilots. And at any given time, one of the pilots is going to grab one of the drones, power it up, and go do a shot. And they just want to be able to grab any drone and immediately bind it real quick and then go do the shot. I guess I could see the point, but if you're thinking that's pretty rare and pretty unusual, I agree. This isn't going to be an option that many people are going to use. One thing to keep in mind is, like, if you were doing this and, like, you had a temporary power dropout for some reason, like your flight controller or your receiver powered down and powered back up again, it would not reconnect and you would not keep flying. It would be in binding mode and your quad would fall out of the air. So yeah, just one more reason that this should be a real edge case. As far as the transmitter side, not much has changed. You will either put a binding phrase into your transmitter, which I recommend, and then every receiver that you bind to that transmitter will take that binding phrase, so you don't actually need to put the binding phrase in manually on the receiver side like I used to do. You can just use the 2-second button press, bind it, it'll be good to go. Of course, you can put it in manually if you want to for some reason. If you choose not to put a binding phrase on your transmitter, then a randomly generated phrase will be used, and all of the receivers that you bind to it will take that phrase instead. One other change that's being made in the web UI is that now, in addition to typing the binding phrase, you can manually type the UID numbers. If you, like, when you enter a binding phrase, it's converted into a UID, and that UID, this series of numbers, is actually the thing that's used to bind. The binding phrase is just used to generate it. So if you have a receiver or a module that has previously had a binding phrase put in, there's no way for you to know what that binding phrase was. But you can just copy those numbers and manually put those numbers into the binding phrase text box if you want to bind additional things to that specific binding phrase. I am so thankful to the ExpressLRS devs for making these changes. I've been asking for this. I've been asking this for a long time. I've been whining about this for a long time. And there's a perspective where you go, whatever, it's complicated. Lots of things are complicated. Just learn it, scrubs. Get with the program. And the reality is that a lot of people coming into this hobby are not super tech nerds. Hard to believe, I know, but it's true. They're just normal people who want to fly, and every hurdle that we throw up in front of them is one more opportunity for them to say, F it, this isn't worth it, I quit. And so I'm just super, super thankful. This was underneath the hood. This was a lot of work. It was way more work than I only know because as I was going, well, why can't you do it this way? Why can't you do it this way? One of the devs was patiently saying, well, there's all these interdependencies that make it really complicated. And kudos to them for not just saying, F you, we're open source devs, we work for free, just do it the hard way, and actually taking the time to make the project better. I think this is going to make ExpressLRS way more accessible to way more people, and I can't wait to start updating my tutorials. I have to go back and update all my tutorials. Well, I can't wait to start updating future tutorials with this new information. ExpressLRS 3.4, as soon as it drops, get on it. This feature alone, I think, is worth it. And if you're wondering what the fastest and easiest way to update to ExpressLRS 3.4 is, I have a video about that. Don't flash over USB. Ugh. Oh, so annoying. Drivers. Ugh. Who wants drivers? No, I'm going to show you what I do, the fastest and easiest way to flash ExpressLRS. Card on screen and link in the video description below.